So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Carolyn Kelly. I'm the Director of Communication and Research for TRIP, and also one of the authors of the report that's being released today that examines road and bridge conditions, congestion, safety, economic development, and transportation funding in Maine. I'm happy to be joined today by Kathy Conlow, who's the City Manager for Bangor, and Tim Doyle, who's the Vice President of the Maine Motor Transport Association. So in a minute, I'll cover the findings of the new report that we're releasing today. Then we'll hear remarks from Kathy and from Tim. Following the remarks, we'll have a brief Q&A. So for reporters in attendance, if you have a question that you'd like to ask of any of the speakers, you'll be able to use the Q&A feature or the raise hand feature to indicate that you'd like to ask a question. I'll be able to temporarily make you a panelist so that you can ask your question of the speakers. And you can submit your question in the chat or raise your hand at any point during our remarks, and then they'll be addressed at the end of the remarks from Tim and Kathy and myself. Before I get to the findings of the report, let me first provide some information about who TRIP is and what we do. TRIP is a national transportation research nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We prepare both national and state-specific reports on a variety of transportation issues, including road and bridge conditions, traffic congestion, highway safety, and economic development. Since TRIP was founded more than 50 years ago, we've produced more than 600 reports in all 50 states. TRIP is supported by a coalition of manufacturing, insurance, construction, labor, and engineering organizations. So with that, let me turn to the findings of the report that we're releasing today, which is titled Maine Transportation by the Numbers, Meeting the State's Need for Safe, Smooth, and Efficient Mobility. The report includes statewide data on the condition of the state's transportation system, and we've also included regional data breakdowns for the Bangor, Lewiston, Auburn, and Portland areas. Maine's transportation network is truly the backbone of the state. It carries more than $80 billion in goods to and from the state each year. It serves the state's 1 million licensed drivers as well as those passing through, and it carries nearly 15 billion vehicle miles of travel annually. As a result of the ongoing pandemic, vehicle travel in Maine dropped by as much as 40% in April, but by October had rebounded to just 12% below the level in the previous October. The condition of Maine's transportation system impacts quality of life, it threatens economic growth, and it has a direct financial impact on the state's drivers. According to the TRIP report, roads and bridges that are deteriorated, congested, or that lack some desirable safety features cost the state's drivers a total of $1.3 billion each year. The average driver in the Bangor area loses nearly $1,600 each year as a result of driving on rough roads. The average Portland driver loses nearly $1,400 each year due to deficient roads. These costs include higher vehicle operating costs as a result of driving on rough roads, it's the financial cost of traffic crashes, and it's the cost of lost time and wasted fuel due to congestion-related delays. So while those costs are already startlingly high, they'll grow even higher in the future unless the state can provide additional funding to improve road and bridge conditions, ease congestion, and enhance safety. Without additional transportation funding at the local, state, and federal levels, Maine's transportation system may continue to deteriorate and become more congested, stifling economic growth and recovery and progress in the state. According to the TRIP report, statewide, 44% of Maine's major roads are in poor or mediocre condition. In the Bangor area, 41% of major roads are rated in poor or mediocre condition, and in Portland, 46% of major roads are rated in poor or mediocre condition. Driving on these rough roads is more than just a nuisance for drivers. In fact, based on TRIP's calculations, Maine drivers lose a total of $563 million each year as a result of driving on deteriorated roads. These costs include accelerated vehicle depreciation, additional maintenance costs, and increased wear and tear as a result of driving on rough roads. In addition to deficient pavements, Maine's bridges are also showing signs of their age, with 13% of the state's bridges rated in poor or structurally deficient condition. This is the 6th highest rate in the nation. In the Bangor area, 13% of bridges are also in poor or structurally deficient condition, and 8% of Portland bridges are rated poor or structurally deficient. Bridges that are rated poor or structurally deficient have significant deterioration to the major components of the bridge. Now, it's important to note that these bridges are safe for travel and that they're maintained and monitored on a regular basis by the agencies that are responsible for their upkeep. But many of these structurally deficient bridges do need significant repairs or even replacement in some cases. The TRIP report also finds that Maine's drivers are contending with increasingly congested roads. In recent decades, the rate of population and travel growth has outpaced the expansion of the state's transportation system, and as a result, the system is increasingly crowded and congested. In fact, in the Portland and Bangor urban areas, drivers lose the equivalent of more than one full day each year stuck in traffic. The average Portland driver loses 28 hours each year stuck in traffic, while Bangor drivers lose 26 hours each year to traffic congestion. The TRIP report includes a list of the 20 most congested corridors in the state. Of that top 20, 17 of them are located in the Portland area. According to the TRIP report, nearly 800 people were killed on the state's roads in the last 5 years. TRIP estimates that roadway safety features were likely a contributing factor in approximately 1/3 of all fatal crashes. This results in $497 million in economic costs in Maine in 2019. These costs include lost workplace and household productivity, property damage, medical and legal costs, congestion costs, and emergency services. So despite the deficiencies that are noted in the TRIP report, it's important to note that these deteriorated roads and bridges are not at all a reflection on the capabilities or the ability of the organizations responsible for maintaining them. In fact, the state DOT and the local municipalities are doing a tremendous job with the funds they have available. But the reality is that the state faces a significant and growing transportation funding shortfall. According to the Maine State Legislature's Blue Ribbon Commission, the state faces a total annual transportation funding shortfall of approximately $232 million. Assuming that the federal government continues to provide approximately 1/3 of Maine's transportation funding, that leaves the state needing to address an annual funding gap of approximately $160 million. As Maine continues to address challenges from COVID-19, including the need for economic recovery, investment in the state's transportation system will be vital in supporting economic growth in the state and recovery. Unless Maine can increase transportation funding at the state, local, or federal level, many critically needed transportation projects may be left stranded on the drawing board. Addressing Maine's transportation funding gap will require increased funding at the local, state, and federal levels. The current federal transportation program, which provides Maine with about $197 million annually for highway and transit improvements, is set to expire this September. It'll be critical that Congress approves a long-term, adequately funded surface transportation program. Increasing investment in Maine's network of roads, bridges, and transit is vital to boosting the state's economy and the quality of life of its residents. In the short term, transportation investments create good jobs, but the long-term benefits of an efficient transportation system connecting Maine's residents, communities, and businesses can last for generations. Without adequate transportation funding, Maine's economic recovery and growth could be stalled, and the state's transportation system will become increasingly deteriorated and gridlocked. So with that, I'll turn things over to Kathy Conlow, who, as I said, is the city manager for the city of Bangor. Kathy, go ahead.
So first, thank you for having me today. And I do want to, the report kind of paints a little bit of a depressing picture and a cliff that we knew was coming for quite some time. And I do want to emphasize the fact that the Maine DOT and our congressional delegation in Washington has been extremely supportive of us. The issue really has been that the pot of money hasn't changed and the pressures on that pot of money have increased. So the report emphasizes those very real challenges that we're experiencing in the Bangor region. Based on our geography and our proximity to the larger markets, our dependence on vehicle truck transportation is really important. Projects such as the 395 corridor improvement project and a number of bridge improvement projects have been greatly appreciated, but they're just not enough for us to keep up. I'm going to go back a little bit and say I've been in Maine for about 18 years. And we've been talking about insufficient funding for infrastructure for the entire 18 years that I've been here. We've talked about this funding cliff and lack of funding, and increasingly we have directed our money towards sort of Band-Aid maintenance projects as opposed to creating expansion projects, capacity projects, or really redoing our road infrastructure. And the Band-Aid approach is setting us back further. So I want to kind of take that from when I first got here to 2021. Our problems are going to be exacerbated by conditions that existed prior to the pandemic haven't changed, and that there's been little change to the funding mechanisms. The pandemic has resulted in less revenues to state municipal budgets. Gas tax, certainly, I think the report highlights the lack of trips that have been made. That's going to translate to a severe reduction in gas tax revenues. And excise taxes. We've been largely dependent on excise taxes, but companies like rental companies and tourism trade that have generally invested in new fleet haven't done that. So we're seeing significant reductions in excise taxes. And also want to point out that costs have dramatically increased. And when you combine the changing weather patterns that we're seeing, I think Bangor feels like we're in a freeze-thaw cycle like every 2 days. That we're not getting those hard freezes that we got even 18 years ago. It's resulting in deterioration of the road surface. To make the money go further, we have used those skinny mixes or thinner mixes, and certainly the cost of petroleum products and the reuse of petroleum products has resulted in poor quality pavement. And all this has sort of sped up the deterioration of our road surfaces, and we're kind of caught in this crazy cycle unless we can catch up. As you're aware, that much of our funding from Maine DOT goes through BACS, which is our regional MPO. A typical BACS project covers about 1/4 of our projects, quarter of the cost of our projects. We're typically funded at 80-10, for 80% federal, 10% state, and 10% local match. Our roads need more funding than we receive through BACS. So Bangor has taken advantage of those 50-50 funding projects through the state of Maine. By the way, they used to be 80-20, and prior to that, they were 90-10. So that has been an increasing cost on the city. And then in 2012, for our local roads, we embarked on a 3-year capital improvement project to bring our roads, bond money to bring our roads from a 28-year repaving schedule to a 12-year repaving schedule. We're now in year 8 of that. The changes to the mix, the composition of, and the weather patterns have made that much more difficult. So we're now in 8 years. I don't see that ending, and we're still struggling to keep up with the pavement surfaces and repairs. So anyway, I guess it's important for us to take a look at these things. This report highlights the need for funding, the need to do more than just thin out the mix or come up with some other creative solutions kind of over. We need to emphasize some reconstruction money, some repaving money. We need to talk about not using the thinner mixes. I mean, there's a lot of funding needs that we have pushed off. And so we're anxious as a city. We've heard a lot of talk over the years about increased money for infrastructure, and we are anxious to see some of that money trickle this way. So that's all I got.
All right. Thank you, Kathy. And with that, I'll turn things over to Tim Doyle.
Good. Thank you also for having me today. I think the TRIP report actually points out what our members and their professional drivers already know, that the status of our roads is in need of repair. You pointed out in the report that Mainers travel 15 billion miles a year on our roads. Our industry accounts for about 1.5 billion of those roads. Almost every community in Maine relies exclusively on trucking to deliver their goods, and the recent pandemic has cast a spotlight on our industry. Certainly never before has the trucking industry been so important to what we do today. All the goods and services we need through this pandemic have moved by truck. Also, the manufactured goods, whether the raw materials moving by logging truckers and those operating, carrying raw goods such as lobster and other things, as well as our manufactured goods. It's vitally important. 92% of all manufactured tonnage in Maine moves by trucks. And in order to do this, we need a safe, reliable, and efficient roadway. So when repairs are up due to poor maintenance, or when congestion slows down the delivery of goods, all that amounts to dollars spent unnecessarily. And so we've participated in the Blue Ribbon Commission and other mechanisms to look at highway funding. I think the need is clear, and the time to do maintenance is now. It doesn't get any cheaper to defer maintenance. And in order to have a vital economy, we need this backbone in our state to be safe and efficient.
All right, thank you, Tim. As I noted earlier, we'll be able to do a brief Q&A. So if any reporters have questions, as I said, you'll be able to drop your question into the Q&A box below, or you can just use the raise hand function, and I'll be able to call on you and elevate you temporarily to being a panelist so that we can hear you, and we'll be able to see you if you've got your camera turned on. At this point, I don't see any questions that have come in yet. We'll give that just one more moment to for any questions to be submitted. But again, I'd like to thank Tim and Kathy for their participation this morning. And I'll also note that we will have a recording of this news conference available on the TRIP website within about 45 minutes. That'll be up there. We've also got some brief clips for each urban area that briefly summarizes the findings for Bangor, Portland, and the Lewiston, Auburn areas. Those are also available on the TRIP website, as well as the full report and news releases for each of the urban areas. I don't see any, oh, I do see one question. So I've got a question from Kayla Fish. So Kayla, I'll add you as a panelist, and once you unmute your line, you'll be able to ask your question directly. So Kayla, I believe that you're muted now, but if you go ahead and unmute, you can ask your question. Looks like Kayla is still muted. I do see another question from Catherine Buxton. So Catherine, while we wait for Kayla to come online, I'll add you in, and you'll be able to ask your question. So Catherine, go ahead.
I haven't had the chance to ask this or to read the report yet, but does it address the increase in electric and the use of electric vehicles and how that might affect funding and maintenance of the roads and bridges? And is that a concern for, Maine Motor Transport and for the city of Bangor as a municipal entity?
So oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Catherine. I'll just say briefly that the report does briefly touch on the impact that electric vehicles will have on the funding revenue that comes in and the sustainability of that revenue. So I'll let Catherine talk about what that means locally.
So we, as a city, support the use of electric vehicles. Electric vehicles in and of themselves don't weigh any less and don't travel any less. They just take their fuel from some other source. So yeah, the lack of funding is a concern. I don't think the use of electric vehicles concerns us. It's perhaps a different funding mechanism or a different way to look at this so that we're receiving adequate funding. Electric vehicles, and I have a hybrid, so electric vehicles produce as much wear and tear on a road as a regular vehicle. They just pay less than gas tax. So I'm willing to pay my fair share for adequate road surfaces. And I think most hybrid electric or electric vehicle owners feel the same way. So it's a funding issue, but not a vehicle issue.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? I just wonder is like, so if the city, if the city of Portland and the city of Bangor and maybe Lewiston support the use of electric vehicles, is that something you can take to the legislature and ask them to maybe consider actually, coming up with a funding mechanism that accounts for the use of electric vehicles?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Catherine. And I got a note from Kayla Fish. She said she doesn't have a microphone, so I'll pose her question. And that is, Kayla asks, what should residents and drivers in the Bangor area take out of this report, and how does it impact the average person? I'll just say, from the perspective of the report findings, certainly it's probably not news to drivers in the Bangor area or anywhere else in the state that the roads that they're driving on are increasingly deteriorated and congested. What they may not realize, though, is that that has a direct financial impact on them. In fact, in the Bangor area, drivers there are losing almost $1,600 each year. This comes at a time when many people can ill afford that. So even though, as I said, this may not be breaking news to people that the roads are deteriorated and congested, it does have a direct impact on people's pocketbooks. And that's why it's so important to make sure that the roads are kept in good repair and that they're well funded. It may cost more in the short term it may come with a large price tag in the short term to pay to fix and maintain and repair these roadways, but that's just a fraction of the costs that are being passed on to drivers. So it's much more cost effective to invest the money in keeping the transportation system in good repair than it is to pass those tremendously high costs on to drivers. And Kathy or Tim, if you'd like to add anything to that, please feel free.
I think you said it well. I don't think it's a surprise here in Bangor that the condition of roads, one, that the budgeting and the increase in revenues that the city's producing to put into roads has gone up quite a bit, but that it's not making that meaningful impact. I don't think that's a surprise, and the impact on people's vehicles. So I think people recognize that. And support. We hear a lot of support in the city for road repaving and maintenance of our infrastructure. The pain of doing it is a different issue, but most people have been very supportive and like those projects, but it's just been difficult to keep up.
And I concur with what you said, Carol. And if the average cost for a person with one car is going up, the same thing is happening for our members who may have one truck or a fleet of 500 trucks. So maintenance costs are an issue, and the better maintained the infrastructure is, the cheaper it is and more efficient it is for our members to run their trucks.
All right, thank you. I see another question from Suzanne Laidman with WMTW. Suzanne, I'll go ahead and make you a panelist and you'll be able to ask your question. You'll just need to unmute your line. Go right ahead.
I was just wondering, do you have like a baseline number of how much money you would need just to maintain the roads as they are and not deteriorate further?
Kathy, do you have a local?
I don't have, I'm sorry, I don't have it based on, I can certainly ask the city engineer, but at this point I don't have one. Mm-hmm. It's a lot.
And I think, again, it's important to note the findings of the Blue Ribbon Commission last year, that the state has a significant funding shortfall in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So the first order of business would be to close that funding shortfall, and then you can begin to make all of the repairs that are needed and get to some of those projects that have been stranded on the drawing board for quite some time.
That's correct.
I think that's right. The Blue Ribbon Commission pointed out the structural gap to be 232 million. About 160 million of that would come from Maine taxpayers and the rest from the federal match. And there's no one easy answer to finding money for the highway fund. If there was, we'd have solved this a decade ago. That's how long we've been talking about it. But the Blue Ribbon Commission does lay down a blueprint for decision makers. Nobody a year or two ago anticipated this pandemic, which has had a serious impact on the Blue Ribbon Commission and its ability to move forward right now with some of the recommendations. So we'll keep talking about it. I too want to thank our congressional delegation, our state DOT, and our lawmakers who are working hard on these issues every day for us.
Okay, I've got another question. This one is for Kathy, comes from W. Arnold. So you can go ahead and ask your question once you unmute your line. So go right ahead. And again, this is for W. Arnold. If you go ahead and unmute, you can ask your question of Kathy. Looks like we may have some trouble unmuting, so I'll go ahead and read the question that was submitted, and this is for Kathy. It says, why do you think the funding that's needed to address these issues has been difficult to secure for the last 18 years?
So I think the mechanism has been the gas tax predominantly. Road maintenance is expensive, and I think that a big part of it is also just the cost of making these improvements. So you take a look at weather conditions that have impacted our road surface quality. You take a look at the cost of road surfacing material. The quality of it has deteriorated as petroleum has been repurposed for other types of products. And you just, so it's and the labor market's gotten tight. So costs for labor have gone up substantially. So I think it's just a combination of a lot of things, and there's just a lot of priorities out there. And, you know, we're faced with all kinds of municipal priorities that include other infrastructure like our wastewater treatment plant and our water systems. They've been requiring substantially more money. Our education system, our buildings are old. I mean, you know, it probably boils down to deferred maintenance. A lot of us as communities grew at certain periods of time, and lots of things come due at the same time. So it's a confluence of a lot of different things, but it's just one element that's been easier, I guess, in some respects, not to deal with as directly as human needs that are standing in front of you. But it has an impact on, certainly on the growth and the human condition in the city of Bangor and the region, because we need to be able to have good jobs, and we need to be able to move our products, and we need to do things. So it's just a confluence of a lot of different things.
And Kathy, I've got one more follow-up question that came in from Catherine Buxton. She said she wanted to ask Ms. Conlow about her comment on freeze-thaw cycle versus the hard freeze. So is that harder on city roads than the typical spring pothole season?
So the freeze-thaw season is something that I think always happened. You always saw it in March, April, and that was the spring pothole season. I think if you drove around Bangor today, based on yesterday's weather, you'd see potholes forming almost as you watch. So I don't have the count, but it was interesting. At one point, our public works director used to count the freeze-thaw cycles in a year and say, you know, here's what's going on. We're just seeing more and more of them. And those are the pothole cycles that you used to typically get more heavily in the spring when we posted roads and things like that. But now we're just seeing them year round. The hard freeze would always protect our road surfaces for the winter months. And then we'd go through a couple freeze-thaw cycles through February, March, April, but now it seems to be ongoing year round.
Okay, I see. One last question. This will be our final question. It comes from Chloe Tebow. Chloe, I'll add you as a panelist. If you unmute your line, you'll be able to ask your question live. So as I said, if you unmute yourself, now you should go ahead and ask your question.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
So you kind of have been touching on this the whole time, but obviously we know the pandemic has really pushed back funding for a lot of things in the state. And like you were saying, even before the pandemic began, this has been an issue for a really long time. So what is kind of the realistic expectation of if and when the state will actually be able to allocate this amount of money? I don't know if that can even be answered, but what are you guys kind of hoping for?
I might be able to take that. I'm in the transportation committee every year discussing highway funding, and the consensus is there's no one answer. There's no magic pill that's going to solve this. But with the fuel taxes not having been increased federally since 1993, and a state gas tax not having increased in several sessions, probably since 2012, you need to look at all sources. So we've talked about a couple of them. Electric vehicles, you know, as Kathy said, they need to pay their fair share. That's all we've ever asked as an industry. We pay our fair share. We may need to look at bonding right now. There's no better time historically to bond than what's happening right now. Interest rates are at historical lows. And so while that may not be many people's preference long-term, it's probably the short-term answer to funding today. Beyond that, we need to go back to the Blue Ribbon Commission and start to discuss and grow consensus around all of the funding options discussed. And that may be looking at general fund spending as well, which is moving some money from the general fund over to the highway fund to help bridge the gap. So again, no one easy answer. If there was, we'd have solved it a decade ago, but we need to continue talking about it and solve it soon.
All right. Thank you. So I believe that'll wrap things up. I don't see any further questions. So thank you everyone for tuning in this morning. Thank you to Tim Doyle and to Kathy Conlow for joining us also. As I said, the full report is available now on TRIP's website. You'll also be able to find a recording of this news conference as well as news releases for each of the urban areas that are covered in the report. So thank you again for tuning in, and please feel free to follow up with myself or Tim or Kathy if you have any further questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.